Welcome to the MHA webinar series, Conducting the Business Impact Analysis, Part 4 of our Introduction to the BIA series. In September, we will have the final part, Part 5, Validation, Analysis, and Presentation. I'm Michael Herrera, CEO of MHA Consulting. I will say I've been now in business continuity for almost 30 years. And of course, the BIA has always been, and in my opinion, for the time being, continue to be extremely critical to the overall business continuity management program. We've heard a lot in the recent past that the BIA needs to be changed. It needs to be put out to pasture. I don't think that's going to change, at least for the time being. I do believe there's many opportunities to improve how we conduct BIAs, to be able to use existing data and information that will hopefully help us, again, better analyze the information, help us make better decisions of what is critical or not. But in the time being, there's always a common approach. And that's what I hope to do today as we go through the questionnaire and the ever important, the interview process. Today, again, everyone is muted. At the end of the session today, we'll make sure we'll take questions and make sure we do our best to answer all of them. If we can't, we'll make sure we get back to you. Thank you very much. So let's get started with conducting the BIA as we talk through today, the questionnaire, the data gathering, and the review of the BIA at the end, what it should look like. Okay. Michael Herrera again with MHA. MHA now has been in business for over 20 plus years. Here in April, we marked our 21st year in operation. Just started prior to that, I was a regional vice president with Bank of America, where I truly believe we were well ahead from the business continuity perspective. And again, learned tremendous amounts had to gain tremendous amounts of knowledge from working at Bank of America and leading those early years of the business impact analysis, where our business impact analysis was truly Microsoft Word templates. We had to gather all the information after handing out these Word templates, do our best to aggregate the data and information, put it all together and get it into a report. In today's complex world, again, that is really difficult to do, but I will tell you, it still can be done. So today, as we talk through the different ways to get this information, I will tell you, if you have to do it using Word, if you have to do it using Excel, you still can. Now, there's a lot of great tools out there that you can use to do this. But again, it can be done. I've done it and did it for many years till we created our own set of tools in order to do that. Now, MHA has worked across a very diverse global client base and done BIAs basically across every industry out there. And again, what we've learned is pretty much, as always, the BIA process, the beauty of it and the methodology applies to whatever industry it's in. Now, there are differences, such as we will discuss in a section here about on the questionnaire, such as impact categories, criticality ratings, different areas that you need to identify specific to your specific category. So you will again be able to see that today, but every industry is different as we conduct BIAs from a culture perspective and how they approach BIAs. I will tell you today, especially with the pandemic, one-on-one interviews, which I believe is the best, we're going to have to alter how we do that in the future, how we handle our BIAs, as well as time constraints. Time constraints we will talk about a little bit later. Businesses today are asking you to take the minimal amount of time when you do BIAs. You must factor that in and make sure you have a very streamlined BIA process. Okay, let's talk about the questionnaire itself and how important the questionnaire is to the BIA process to ensure it's concise, it's to the point, it doesn't go outside the mission of the BIA. So in determining the approach, we're going to talk about first about questionnaires. We're going to talk about the interview methods, which I believe the one-on-one interview, of course, is the best, as well as a workshop method, which is used, at least we've seen, infrequently. And as I stated earlier today, the questionnaire is truly the cornerstone of the BIA. You know, this questionnaire, whether you're using a tool, a Word template, an Excel sheet, has to be standardized so that as you're asking for specific information, whether that's the pre-work aspect and or the BIA, that it's standardized. And again, you're asking for the same information each and every time. Very important. In addition, by using a questionnaire, it's a very efficient and time-saving data gathering approach. So Make sure you have the questionnaire standardized. Make sure that it's designed so it can be efficient and time saving. And many times we'll see questionnaires that, again, too voluminous, too many questions outside of what the philosophy and approach of the BIA should be. Here's some of the nightmares we've seen. As we talk about what should be in the questionnaire and what should not be, some of the nightmares we've seen with people's BIA questionnaires, and again, this doesn't matter if it's in a Word template, an Excel sheet, or in a system. Some of the nightmares are incomplete instructions. So many times we'll see our business unit participants struggle because there's incomplete instructions as to how do I handle this questionnaire? How do I prepare myself to work with the business continuity office to complete the questionnaire? What's expected of me? Also, what assumptions am I going to use during the BIA? This is probably one of the biggest ones. Do I, one of we'll talk a bit about later, but some of the key assumptions, such as not considering any recovery plans or strategies, assume peak time. You have to make sure they understand those key assumptions you're looking for so you get the right data and information back. A lack of training and support. As you go through this process, you have to make sure, again, remember, your business units that you're trying to conduct this BIA for, they're not BIA experts. So you have to understand, you have to give them the proper amount of training and support so that it's not an obstacle. So they understand what a business impact is and what it isn't, how much time is expected of them. So again, they become your partner in the process and not an enemy. And then lastly, one of the nightmares we've seen is where BIA questionnaires become too complex and too voluminous. We've seen questionnaires with 40, 50 questions in the BIA, asking questions that are outside the approach. So be very careful, making sure your questionnaire in your program does not become a nightmare. Okay, questionnaires can be in many different formats, as I discussed earlier. Now, I will tell you which is infrequent versus more frequent. We rarely see any more paper forms, but we do have clients that when we initially come to work with them, they've conducted their BIA still in the old paper form, whether that's Word, Excel, Adobe Acrobat forms, etc. So we see this pretty infrequently today. And again, as we continue to evolve, that's going to go away, and more, as most all are in electronic format. And those that are not using BIA-based systems are typically using more Excel-based forms. Now, the Excel-based forms work well. At MHA, we use Excel-based forms for many years. But as we all know, as your company becomes highly complex, diverse, geographically spread with many different divisions and departments, aggregating that data and information, making sure people haven't changed formulas, that becomes a true nightmare. So it's very, very important that, again, you have to consider all of that when you're starting to create your questionnaire. How do I need it to work? How do I need to aggregate the data and report on it? The beauty of today's world is if you decide to not go even with the BIA cloud-based tools, there's other databases you can create on your own that allow you to do this and aggregate and report on the information. In today's discussion, we're just going to use screenshots from our BIA tool. This is no means to try to drive you to our tool, but just to show you, because the concepts in our tool still work whether you're using an Excel form, a Word template, and or some other tool. Okay, elements of a good questionnaire. This is critical for everyone to understand. This is my personal philosophy as to what should be in a good questionnaire. First and foremost, number one, business unit overview. There should be in your questionnaire a section of it that basically covers an overview of the business unit, what it is, what it does, hours of operation, anything in the next 12 to 18 months that could impact the business impact analysis, such as, am I reorganizing? Do I have new systems coming online? Any new legal and regulatory requirements, etc. Those things that, again, in the overview is more of just what do you do, who you are, what you do, when you do it, what's your peak time, and then any key challenges or changes coming in the next 12 to 18 months that we must consider, because we may need to come back to this business unit when those specific challenges or changes are made that could impact the criticality of that specific business unit and the processes. So first and foremost element of good questionnaire is the business unit overview. The second piece is, again, very important, a section in your questionnaire to identify and analyze the specific core business functions or processes of that specific business unit. Now, let's talk a little bit about one of the things that I will tell people. If you've not done a BIA in many, many years, limit the number of processes you want your units to identify. Typically, if a BIA hasn't been done in 3 years or more, we typically will tell our client, could you please have your business units only identify the 5 to 7 most critical processes they perform? So that's the second element of a good questionnaire, to again have a section where you begin to identify and inventory the core business functions or processes they perform. Also, additionally, you need to make sure you have good definitions. What's a process versus an activity? This year, we've seen some business impact analysis participants, they'll note 25 to 30 processes. And after you go back and analyze, you truly realize they're activities. The majority of those are activities, not processes. So you have to be very clear when you do work with your units as to what is a process versus an activity. Number 3, in your questionnaire, you want to identify all your regulatory, legal, or service level impacts. This is again very critical, that you're able to identify in your questionnaire if a process is disrupted, what's the regulatory, legal, or service level impact if we cannot perform that process? Very important. Next, we're going to have to identify, if you look at industry standards for a business impact analysis, identify the quantitative and qualitative impacts if I couldn't perform that process over time. So it's dollar and non-dollar impacts, such as loss of revenue, penalties, fines, and sanctions. Then we look at the non-dollar impacts, such as impact to customer service, as well as operating efficiencies, etc. So you have to define what are the impact categories that you're trying to identify for each of these processes that you're evaluating the impact over time. Now, there's no magic set of categories. Every industry is a little bit different, but typically most will have some common when it comes to loss of revenue, impact to customer service, operating efficiencies, etc. You also then in your questionnaire need to make sure that it identifies and allows for identifying all of the supporting systems and applications for each process. Because remember, in the end game, the business impact analysis is to tell me not only what processes are most critical, when they need to be recovered, but also all of their dependencies. And of course, one of those key dependencies is our key supporting systems and applications. Very important. Okay, dependency, internal and external. That's another part, again, very important. Very important here that dependencies, internal and external, are noted. I think during pandemic and COVID-19, it was so critical. Many have found, what are my upstream versus downstream dependencies? Your questionnaire should allow for each of your processes, what are their internal dependencies, external, and are they upstream or downstream? Because that's becoming very, very important, knowing what each process depends on in order to do its business. Number 7, manual workarounds. Now, some people may look at us and go, Michael, why are you even trying to look at manual workarounds? We still have clients that rely heavily on manual workarounds, and that is important. You want to know, do I have a manual workaround for especially loss of technology? Now, many don't today, and those, interestingly enough, that do have manual workarounds, don't document them and don't test them. So very important in your questionnaire that you allow for that. And then, of course, all the vital records each process depends on. What do they depend on? Electronic? Is it a paper vital record? Is it in microfiche or microfilm? We still have many clients that still have microfiche and microfilm vital records. But this, as you can see, is an element, all the elements of a good questionnaire. From knowing what the business does on an overview, to our processes, assessing regulatory impacts, legal impacts, the dollar, non-dollar impacts, the dependency on systems, the dependencies on internal and external business units, manual workarounds, and vital records. So let's cover this a little more in depth. Now, when you're designing your questionnaire, as I stated earlier, here's some tips and traps. Very important to remember. Less is more. I have a very specific philosophy for the business impact analysis. Its job is, again, give me the relative criticality, my business units, their processes, and their dependencies that they rely on in order to do the business. It's not there to give me the recovery strategy. It's not there to help write their complete plan. It's there to tell me key aspects of that specific business unit and their processes. So less is more. Remember, again, in designing your questionnaire, after doing thousands of BIAs, the people that are coming to your business impact analysis, they are not experts in this area. You got to get them in, ask them the right information, make sure it's efficient and effective, and get out. Okay? That goes down to the next one. If you do this right, you're going to ask the relevant and appropriate questions. Kind of goes back to what I consider elements of a good questionnaire: relevant and appropriate questions. Make sure you have the good instructions. If you've never done a BIA or haven't done one in a while, Make sure that you have those instructions and validate them. We're going to talk a little bit about running a pilot test on your questionnaire and your process. Make sure those questions are validated. Test them to make sure that you have no issues, some are missing, etc. For yourself and your business units that are participating, minimize the effort to enter and extract information. If there's nothing worse, and I want to say we've done everything perfect, because we've been, as we were starting to create tools as well as working with the old day Excel spreadsheets, there were times that the effort to enter and extract information was gargantuan and it didn't go well. So make sure as you design your questionnaire and your entire process, you minimize that effort. As I already stated earlier, don't make the BIA do more than its mission. We've talked about that enough already, but again, keep that first and foremost in your mind. Make it easy for everybody to use your questionnaire and understand what you're asking for. Clean, neat, and simple. That way, then you have less errors, you have less phone calls. And as I always tell our staff, one of the best things that you want to shoot for in your mission is when people get done with the BIA interview, you love when they say, this wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. That is one of the key things that I'm like, wow, we did our job. And then lastly, keep the language simple and clear. Do not use acronyms, spell it all out. And again, we'll talk a little bit about having all that right reference information when you do your business impact analysis interviews to make sure they understand what you're asking for. Because again, go back to that whole process. They are not BIA experts. So you got to design all that as you design your questionnaire and your BIA process. Okay, pilot questionnaire. So important as we go through this, and I'll show you how it has been designed. But for those that have not done a BIA, I would highly recommend test it. Use a group or a couple of groups that you know will provide good objective information. They will test the questionnaire for you. You will be able to validate, first of all, is it easy to use? Is the language simple and clear? Do they know how to help us complete the questionnaire? Or is the data that comes out valid? So this gives you a chance, again, before you implement this on an enterprise level or even on a smaller scale than enterprise, but it allows you then to vet it to make sure that it works and you feel comfortable that you can now spread this out to the rest of the organization. We've even done this even with our tool that, again, we've used over thousands of times, but in some organizations, we feel it's best that we still go out and test it with a small model group to allow us to make sure, are the calculations coming out with what we need it to do? Are our threshold values being properly set so that we can make sure that what we already know is critical shows up as being critical? Because again, this is a model. You have to understand that. And always remember, your BIA is only a point in time reference. So again, it's a point in time reference and it needs to be updated and refreshed. But I highly recommend the pilot questionnaire if you're new to doing BIAs, if you haven't done one for a while, and if you're having a whole new process implemented. It's best to do it with a small group first. So again, you don't want to throw this out to 100 different groups and have chaos. So we already talked in review, designing the questionnaire. We're going to go a little bit more in depth further down. But again, remember, it all comes down. The questionnaire is truly the cornerstone of the BIA. It all depends on how well you facilitate that right questionnaire that works well for you. Okay. All right. Methods of data gathering with the questionnaire. We're going to talk about two approaches. One is the interview method, which I love personally. I really believe in many, many years now of doing this. The one-on-one, or even again, today's world, we're doing so many BIAs in a remote fashion, but it's still that interaction on getting the information. We've had many clients over the years ask us to do workshop method. This is more where we bring our participants in and then train them on how to do it. We don't do that as much anymore. And again, I'll just, as we go through it, I don't believe it's as effective as the interview methods, whether that's remote or one-on-one. Now, interviews are time consuming, but they definitely, I will tell you this, they do a number of things. One, as a business continuity office, you get to build that one-on-one relationship with those business unit participants. You get to meet them, talk to them, understand their business, have some discussion that's not just about the BIA. And in the end, you'll find it's going to give you the best quality information. Gives you that chance to meet, discuss what they do, understand how critical or not critical it is, and you always end up getting the best quality information versus in a lot of cases with the workshop method, you throw the information out, ask them to complete it, and it's typically in most cases not what you were looking for. One of the things that we try to do, especially when I first started doing BIAs many years ago, is I always made sure, and I tell this to our staff, is to ensure that they ask the same questions in the interviews as we're going through. We have a process in the steps, but make sure you document the questions that you want to be asking, or the different things you're going to be looking for as you go through your questionnaire. The reason I say that is it allows you, then you're asking the same questions at each interview. So you can make sure the data that comes out is concise, to the point, and most importantly, it's consistent. And that's number three. Just be very consistent. Make sure the structure and agenda and timing of the interview is the same for everybody. Now, this doesn't mean if you have highly complex groups, you may take longer than others. Now, how long should it take to do my interviews? We've reached the point at MHA that our interviews typically are running an hour and a half to 2 hours. Some, because of our background and our benchmark information and experience, we can even cut that time down even more. But a good average to use is, for the interview, should take about an hour and a half to two. We'll talk a little bit about the pre-work, which really helps speed things along. And I'm telling you, I'll be completely upfront. When we started MHA, it took a long time to get to where we're at today. How to clear that process down to was very succinct and to the point. Now, use one person to facilitate and one to enter data into the questionnaire. You're going to learn as you begin to do one-on-one interviews, you're going to learn that it's really good to have one person facilitating and one to enter data into your questionnaire, whether that's an Excel sheet, whether that's in Word, or if you're using a BIA cloud-based type system that you have. We really find that it allows, especially if you're new to it, it allows the one person to facilitate and focus on the questionnaire, the other one just to take the data in. Many of our consultants, though, reach the point where they're very comfortable facilitating and entering data at the same time. But there are cases in highly complex environments, we still have the one person to facilitate and one to enter data. So we make sure we don't miss any data or information from that interview. Now, number 5, be prepared for interviewees to not be ready. I can't stress number 5 enough. In your interviews, be ready for that. Or additionally, they'll bring in too many people to your interviews. So be prepared for interviewees to not be ready. You may have to, again, conduct the BA on the fly and get through your questionnaire. We like to send out pre-work. Pre-work has become one of our hallmarks that we like to use. By completing the BIA, we probably cut off around 30% of the time to do the BIA or more. So we send out BIA pre-work, which is a smaller version of the full questionnaire. So we can get at least 40 to 50% or even maybe 60% of the information we actually need for the interview. Provides that base of information that gives the business unit time to think about, to put their information down on, that we need in our form, and then we're able to upload it into our tool. So now here's the other thing that you have to be prepared for. Today's people's attention span, as we all know, is very minimal. So by doing the pre-work, it will help you when you get to the interview, because again, by having that data ahead of time, trust me, their time span and their attention span is going to be short. You want to have as much data information ahead of time. Once we send out the pre-work, we validate it. We make sure then you upload that completed pre-work into your questionnaire. That pre-work, again, I'll show you an example of what you should look for and what you should ask for, and then taking that information and putting it up to your BIA tool, whatever that will be. Total time I've talked about an hour and a half to 2 to complete a BIA interview, about a half an hour to do the pre-work, and about a half an hour for them to validate their data once we're done. So total time it should take us, again, half hour on the front end, up to 2 hours during the interview, half hour on the back end. You're typically looking at this point, you're not looking at any more than three and a half hours at the most, even for the longest. That business, we've found that companies and management really likes that we've cut it down to a very manageable time. Years past, I remember that we would spend 4 to 6 hours on a BIA, which today would be totally unacceptable. So you need to get yourself and your team so you can get it down to an effective time so you don't waste people's time and you get them in there and out. Number 10, provide reference material at the interview sessions. As you will see in a second, whether that's remote or one-on-one, or whether you're going to use the workshop session, you're going to need to provide the right reference material. And then lastly, I'm going to say, schedule no more than 3 interviews in a day. Those of you that are listening today and have done this, try to do no more than 3 interviews a day, because we all know it is extremely complex and again, very mentally taxing. Okay, here's how, in conducting the actual interview, make sure in each and every interview you do, again, go back over and define the purpose of the interview in the BIA process. I can't, again, that is so important. They don't know, they will forget what you've asked of them, what you've communicated. Go back over what you're asking them for in this session. So have that agenda item and know exactly what you need to say, and say, here's why you're doing the BIA interview. Here's the information we're going to ask for, and here's the information you're going to get out. And what are the next steps after you've completed the BIA? Very important, establish rapport with the interviewees. There are different personalities of different departments, whether you're working with engineers, HR, marketing, doctors, nurses, many different types of cultures and personalities. As the BC office, this is one of your best opportunities to really establish rapport with the different groups across your organization, to understand what they do, and for them to get confidence with you that you know what you're doing. As consultants, we have to do that because, again, we're coming from the outside. We're there to make sure they feel confident. We're not wasting their time. We understand what they're trying to do, what they're doing in their business. So take the time and the opportunity to establish great rapport with interviews. This will yield great results way after the BIA is done. All right, make sure they understand again what information is being sought. If you send out the pre-work, which we're going to go over, they already know what you're asking for. Now, one real quick thing on pre-work. It used to be we'd send it out and people would send it back. With people's time schedules today, most of our clients are asking, would you please mind taking 30 minutes with our business units to help them do their pre-work so it gets done? So be prepared for that. Most people now are saying, even though you send out the pre-work, call them, help them get through it. You will again speed things up even more. Okay, very important during the interview, you must explain the following key assumptions. You may have more. Remember, we always tell them this disruption is disaster neutral. And then what we say that is we just say you cannot perform the process. It's not due to a fire, a flood, an earthquake, a hurricane. You just can't perform it. That's it. You have no recovery plans or capabilities. If you don't tell them that and they have recovery plans or capabilities, they may minimize the impacts. They may say the impact isn't as great. So disruption is disaster neutral. Do not consider any plans, recovery plans or capabilities you have in place, and consider that this happens at the worst or peak processing time. So in the end, what we're looking for is, what's the maximum impact to my organization if I couldn't perform this process, so that we design the right recovery strategies and build our recovery plans appropriately based on the criticality. Okay. You will also, in your interview, go through what kinds of quantitative and qualitative information, dollar and non-dollar. Here's what's interesting is many times management will say, I don't know if my business units really know what the impact is of them from a dollar or non-dollar perspective. Do they really know what loss of revenue is to their area and how it will impact the company? Do they know any penalties, fines, and sanctions? Do they really know what the impact is to customer service or experience or operating efficiencies? And I always tell management, don't worry. These are folks on your business side. They run business day to day. They know what they're doing, and I will tell you, over time, we've really had no issues. People will do their best to give you their best educated guess as to here's what the dollar impacts will be and our non-dollar impacts. They know their business. So trust in them. But again, you need to, at times, you may need to push back, but trust, but define what type of actual information you're looking for, and we'll show you that in a second. I always like to work the interview in a very systematic manner, and people like that because, again, as you work the interview process, you may need to let people talk if it's valid and good information. If it isn't, pull them out and get them back to where you need them to be focused. But work the interview in a systematic manner, so each time as you go through your interview process, it's a consistent way to get through it. Those of you that have not done one before, go through the questionnaire, do a mock interview, understand how I'm going to work that interview from the time I ask them who they are as a department all the way through to their dependencies. Time yourself, understand how to work that interview in a very systematic manner, so it becomes kind of like robotic in a way, but guess what? You will get through it in a very consistent way and also improve the consistency of your data and information. Now, you may have to return for more information, so be prepared for that. Make sure you have a list that you can track your action items from the interview. I may need to get back to you. Maybe they don't remember a specific system, or they may have a new process they forgot about. So you may need to return for more information, but most importantly on your side, track it and make sure that you can get back to it and make sure at the end you have the completed BIA that's valid for that unit. Please don't get bogged down in the minutia. There's nothing worse that drives me crazy is when you get bogged down in the minutia that has no value to the BIA. As a facilitator and the leader of that interview, as you're working through your questionnaire, don't let them get bogged down in the minutia that doesn't have value. So be prepared for that, move them on, and go forward with your interview. Okay, so those are the one-on-one. Now, as I stated earlier, in today's environment, we're not doing any one-on-one business BIA interviews. Everything is remote. I think today we're very lucky in that we have the right tools to do that easily and very effectively and efficiently. Last thing I'll mention on doing your BIA interviews, in your kickoff communications, we'll talk about in a few seconds here, ensure you have the right people at those sessions. This last year, we've had business units, even though we thoroughly explained to them who we're looking for to come to the meetings, where we've had 10 or 12 people in the BIA interview session, where after we asked others to leave, we ended up with 2 to 3. So make sure, again, in your BIA interviews, you only get the right number of people. Don't waste people's time. Get those who really understand the processes. If that's 1, that's fine. If it's 2, okay. But I don't think most cases you're going to need 7, 10, 12 people. So workshop method. I'm only going to cover a slide or 2 on this. This is where we've been asked before when I need to present my questionnaire, because they don't want you to do one-on-one interviews, and they basically want you to have a workshop to train people how to complete the questionnaires and go off and do it on their own. This is not being done as much, if at all, at least with MHA. Everybody wants the one-on-one interviews or the remote interviews so that we can work with them and get the right information. But this is the time you can do this with large number of BIA participants. You can talk to them about the BIAs, what we're looking for in the questionnaire, and set them off on their own. But even if you do this, make sure you have a very manageable meeting size, because again, you're trying to get this information to people that they've never done before. So you got to make it manageable so you can easily have the forum for them to ask a lot of questions and get the right information to them. Again, like I said, very, very little time, very few times now we've done this ahead of time, done this in a workshop method. The majority, if not all of our BIAs, again, are back to that 101 methodology. But some of you may be asked to do the workshop method, so be prepared for that as well. So methods of data gathering and summary, very important. The workshop, again, more of a train the trainer for large groups. If your management doesn't want, again, that one-on-one approach to it, but it's basically used infrequently. And I'll tell you, speaking from experience, workshop has not worked best for us. We've had to go back to many groups to get the right information, or they just don't understand the instructions, no matter how well they've been written or vetted. And you'll end up spending more time having to go and correct data and information in your BIA. So if at all possible, I'm going to say, don't go the workshop method if at all possible. Still work in the interview process. Now, some people, it is time consuming to do the BIA interviews, I'll tell you that, but there's so many benefits to not only the business unit participants, but a lot of benefits to you as the BC office. We've had clients that have actually brought executives to go to every BI interview, because at the end, guess what? Those executives learn what the entire company does. What does it depend on? What key resources do they need? It really, at the end, the BIA is a playbook of here's here's the framework or skeleton of the entire company. So even though it may be time consuming, highly valuable, provides with the best data and information you need. The small groups works well. Remember that I talked to you about it. Make sure you only have the right people in those interview sessions that need to be there, and work hard to get your BI interviews to an hour and a half to 2. Last thing I'll say on the interview side, if you're not a good facilitator, make sure you find a good facilitator. BC people, I tell that to them all the time. Work hard on your facilitation skills. Make sure you know you can facilitate a solid interview in an hour and a half to 2. Get through it. But again, if you're not, get the training or get somebody to help you be that good facilitator. All right, let's go back to the questionnaire very quickly. So as I stated earlier, the questionnaire is really the crux of it. You need the interview, the good facilitator, but it all comes down to what does a questionnaire do? We've seen tools used. And again, tools can be Word, they can be Excel templates, they can be a BIA tool. You can create your own simple database to go off and do this as well. So there's myriads of ways to do it. Most people are looking today to be able to use a tool or a database they've designed on their own, because again, as companies become complex, you need to aggregate and slice and dice that information. So it's easy to see not only what's happening at a department level, but what's happening at a company or division level, et cetera. That questionnaire should inventory all that business information that we're going to talk about. It also will allow you to assess multiple business functions or processes. We talked about then earlier as well that most business units, if they haven't done a BIA, we're looking for them to identify at least the most critical 5 to 7 business processes they perform, so we can analyze those and identify criticality. Once they've at least done that first BIA, the next time it's conducted, you can add additional. So keep your first BIA, if you haven't done one in a while, keep it simple. Don't try to do too many processes. Your tool should all automatically calculate the RTOs, or recovery time objectives, for each business process based on the impacts that were entered. It has to do that. You do not want to have to be spending time going back and looking at what impacts they entered to try to determine it manually. The tool, whatever it is, should help you and or calculate the recovery time objectives for you. That's the entire crux of this process. Because remember, you're trying to tie the RTO for the process with all of its dependencies in the end. Now, make sure you set up your questionnaire, you design it, you build it, you test it with a pilot questionnaire before you conduct any of your live interviews or workshops. Make sure it's ready to go, so that when you have it, if there's no issues, will it work, will it not? Okay, now in setting up the questionnaire, here's what's very important. We stress this, and we stress this to management, and yet we still have issues at times with management being prepared to do this. The way that we set up our BIA is this: the setup of the tool is absolutely critical, because how we set up our quantitative or our dollar impact categories, our non-dollar impact categories, how we're weighting our categories, how we're setting our impact scales, as well as our RTOs and RPOs, recovery time objective or recovery point objective categories. It's setting up the operating criteria on how this questionnaire is going to work. If we don't set these categories up properly, in the end, we may not get the right data and information we're looking for. And at many times, management won't spend the time or ensure they spent the right amount of time looking at this to make sure it's valid to them. So in setting up on how your questionnaire is going to do the calculations, the information it's going to use from the categories to the impact scales, spend the right amount of time with your management to make sure it's set up properly and it makes sense for your organization. Additionally, make sure in setting up the questionnaire, you also have a good idea as what business units are going to be participating in the study. This is sometimes hard for management to understand. Which units do I want to start my BIA with? I would recommend, if you haven't done a BIA in the past, start with a phased approach. Start with a small set of business units you can show success with. Don't try to boil the ocean and try to get all of your business units. Focus on those that, again, you can work with, gives you show success, validates your process and your methodology, and then grow from there. But make sure management is prepared to help you with that, as well as setting all the operating criteria so that there's no surprises when the RTOs, the recovery time objectives, come out. They understand they were part of the setup of all of the critical data and information needed to get that output. This just gives you an idea as to what our tool, and again, it's not meant in any way for anyone to go use our tool, but you can use the same approach, whether it's an Excel sheet, whether it's another database. But in our setup, this is how we begin to set up our tool in those categories I talked about just earlier. First, we set up our impact categories. We set up our dollar and non-dollar impact categories. As I stated earlier, there's no magic set of categories. Each industry may be a little bit different. For example, hospitals, they're going to, instead of customer service down here, they may have patient care and experience or safety. They're going to have a few little bit different impact categories than a bank. But you can see here's some very typical: loss of revenue. Here's a impact to liquidity, fines, penalties, and sanctions. So impact categories are absolutely critical, because this is how we're going to analyze each and every process over time. Now, one of the key things that we've changed in the time is we've provided weighting for each of our categories. This is really important, because in the past, what do you always hear management say? Management will always tell you that everybody turns out to be critical. This is the way that you ensure, this is your way of balancing that by weighting the categories that are most important to your organization on order of priority. That makes sure in the end, when you go through the calculations, what comes out as critical should be aligned with the mission of your company. Very important. Okay. Now, so weightings should be add up to 100%, and these are the weightings. Now, one thing I want to note on weightings: hospitals, in many cases, will weight patient care and safety much higher than revenue, whereas banks and other financial institutions are going to weight loss of revenue, impact to liquidity, for example, much higher than others. Okay, all right. Let's go on now to setting our ranges. So once we've identified our quantitative and qualitative impacts, or dollar, non-dollar, we then need to determine what is our financial impact categories that we're going to use for the varying levels of impact. And you can see here, this particular test information, you can see we've got everything from none to negligible, which is 0 to $500,000, to catastrophic is over 100 million. So you need to also then work with your individual financial groups or your CFO to figure out what are the financial impacts that we need for our specific organization. Now, in our tool, we score for dollar and non-dollar. 1 is always none to negligible, 5 is catastrophic. So those are that's a scoring, as you will see a little later, how we ask what's the impact of the process not being able to be performed, whether it's dollar or non-dollar. We use 1 to 5 for dollar, 1 to 5 for non-dollar. The tool uses that in combination with the weighting to help determine the criticality and the subsequent RTO. You also need to define your RTO, or recovery time objective, categories in your questionnaire. You need to have this set ahead of time. In the end, the BIA, its whole purpose is to plug in where each of the processes fit from a recovery time objective. The tool that you're using, again, whether it's Excel spreadsheet, your own database, or a BIA tool, should be calculating your recovery time objectives. You need to set up what are my recovery time objectives for my organization. Use realistic recovery time objective categories for your organization. If you're just starting, don't set a necessarily very stringent recovery time objectives. Make sure they're recovery time objectives that are realistic to your industry and your organization. Those such as hospitals, banks, casinos, other organizations that have very tight timelines, supply chain type companies, their recovery time objective categories are going to be much shorter. They're going to start in the 0 hours, the 4 hours, or even 1 hour. Others, for example, we have clients that are construction companies. Their recovery time objectives aren't as stringent. Their first category may be 24 hours. So again, make our recovery time objective categories relevant to your organization and your industry. Last piece in the recovery point and in the questionnaire, setting up your recovery point objectives. Now, I will tell you upfront, recovery point objective again is what's my maximum tolerance for data loss in the system that I need for a process. That's really hard to get across to your business unit participants. You need to really work with them and have them understand what is that maximum data loss that I can sustain based on legal requirements, regulatory, do I have manual workarounds, etc. Some of the things we've seen with IT is that they're currently able to back up data so well in some cases that all of their entire enterprise data may have an RPO of 15 minutes, and they'll say, don't even ask the RPOs anymore because we're already backing it up to such a high level. So be very careful in setting up your RPO categories, understanding what IT does today, so that you can talk to the recovery point objective. So as they identify each system they need, they're able to give you a good educated answer as to what should the recovery point objective be. Because remember, this then all goes back to IT. Now they got to establish new recovery strategy, backup strategies, etc. for the data. Okay, preparation and pre-work. Now, we have a very defined time schedule for our BIA. We have now a life cycle through it. Typically, we'll send out to participants at least 4 weeks before their interview in a workshop. We'll send out when we're going to, hey, we want to let you know we're doing a BIA. It's been approved by management. Here's what we're asking you to do. Here's when we're looking for you to do it. You then outline the participant responsibilities and their time commitments. That is huge. Everybody's going to be asking you, well, how much time do you want? And don't be prepared for people that doesn't matter if management says so or says you will do it. Some will flat out refuse to participate. So be ready for that. We had a entity I think it was about a year ago, our consultant was in the room. They were ready for their interview. The individual came into the room, stated, I already know I'm critical, and left the room. Let's just say that individual had to come back a little later and complete the interview. So we've seen it all. We've seen those that have been so well prepared, understand the importance, and they just do a great job. And we've had others that do not want to be there. So outline the participant responsibilities and time commitments as best you can. Make sure you understand too those that may be trouble ahead of time. And then again, we always outline here's the pre-work that's going to be required. And like I stated earlier, in today's attention span deficit time period, you're most likely going to have to call them and help them through the pre-work, which ends up benefiting you in the end anyway, and them as well. So we send out the pre-work at least a couple of weeks before the interview. And again, it's a modified version. We don't ask for perfection in completing it. But boy, we get that information, throw it into our questionnaire before they show up for the interview, and we can speed. We can do a lot. We can do the interview quicker. They've also had some time to think about the data and information we're asking, so it's not just being done at the time of the interview like we used to do. So we send that out a couple weeks before. The majority will get it done before the 2 weeks. Again, be prepared for those that turn it in at the last minute, and it's still going to require a lot of work in the interview, or those that just simply don't turn it in. And you got to be good at doing that on the fly. Very important. Okay. So in this pre-work, we ask for a modified version of what we're looking for. High-level business unit information, key business processes, list the supporting systems for those processes, any legal, regulatory, and existence of dependencies. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just get as much as you can in there. We try to limit the pre-work to have them take no more than 30 minutes to complete. That's why I said it helps a lot of times now that we're on the phone with them and completing it, or one-on-one actually if we had that opportunity. And we try to get all that information back to us about a week before the actual BIA interview or workshop, because it gives us time to validate it, make sure they're not missing some big gaps. Maybe we need to send it back to them and say, hey, can you complete this? So very, very important to have that pre-work. Now let's talk about what that pre-work looks like. So here's a sample again from our tool. You can do the same thing in whatever tool you have. Through our tool, we send out a pre-work link. And by doing that, they're able to get this and complete it either by themselves or with us. And it basically asks, as you can see, high-level department information, as well as then by critical process, what's the name of their critical processes, a brief description, systems, applications, any highly specialized equipment they need, and internal and external dependencies. Now, as I stated earlier, if you haven't done interviews for a really long time, limit the number of processes that they can perform, that they are allowed to add here. Typically, as you see here, we always list no more than 5 to 7 maximum critical business functions or processes. And that helps in this first set of interviews you do. Once you continue to evolve your BIA, you may ask for what others do you have outside of those critical business processes or functions. But again, pre-work has been invaluable. Okay, here's a sample of a completed BIA pre-work, and we have that as well as they complete it, so they understand that they're completing it in the right manner. Here's a perfectly completed BIA pre-work for the finance and accounting, giving us a solid description, the number of employees, hours of operation, and then here's an example of just one of the processes, which was payroll management, a description, what systems they need, specialized equipment, internal and external dependencies. You always hope you get a well-completed questionnaire. It's not always the case, but be prepared. You get as much as you can and you use it. But again, pre-work really helps, and upload that then to your data, up to your tool. Okay, so once I get that information from that business unit, I validate it looks good, I upload it up to my tool, and now whatever that tool is, whether it's an Excel sheet or again our system, you get it uploaded, you're now ready to prepare and get ready for that interview. So you in there, you'll have their processes, dependency requirements, any specialized equipment, and now let's go to the interview. All right, conducting the interview. This is extremely critical. And it took me a lot of years to get through really getting prepared for BIAs, because again, you got a lot of people in there, they're looking at their watch, they're looking at their laptops. Make sure you're well prepared, as we talked about in the preparation, even ahead of this slide, making sure you're the right agenda. You know which questions, how you're going to answer the specific questions to get through your questionnaire. What's the systematic approach I'm going to use? But also very important in the BIAs are some of the logistics. Sometimes people will say, well, how's that really part of the process? Well, doing thousands of BIAs, I will tell you, you better have if you're able to do this one-on-one again here soon, make sure you have that right conference room set up with all of the right video conferencing if you need it, to do on-site or remote BIAs, making sure you have the right people to help you facilitate that BIA, yourself as a facilitator, your scribe to take all your information. You may also, in many cases, because of the complexity of the systems and applications being used, will often have information technology liaison in the room. So they help remind that business unit of the systems they use if they miss something. They also make sure that we list the right system names, so we don't miss anything in advance. So make sure you have the right conference room set up, the right video conferencing, because there's nothing worse than two people coming in a room, it's too small, it's not the right temperature, etc. So very important. Okay, if you need to, especially today, are you going to use a screen to display your questionnaire as you enter the information or not? We have consultants that don't like to put the screen up anymore because they're watching you as you type. So some will just go through the questions, enter the information, and show them the results at the end. So it'll have to be something you want to decide. I personally like to have the screen up and show my questionnaires. I'm entering the information. That's all up to you and how you want to handle it. But again, a lot of times people feel great because they can see you're completing it and they're getting through it. We already talked about the amount of time to schedule. Make sure though, when you have multiple interviews, give yourself anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes between each interview so that you can gather yourself, make any notes, get that one interview completed, and then be able to move on to the next one. So don't try to schedule on top of each other because back to back. We've done that, it doesn't work. And remember, schedule no more than 3 interviews a day. We've done 4, we've done 5, and it will tell you it's mentally taxing. And again, it leads to poor data and information gathering. Make sure you confirm attendance. This is something that nothing more that drives us crazy, but you must confirm attendance because you will find during your BA interviews, you're going to have to reschedule. Be prepared for at least 10 to 20% to reschedule. You need to be prepared for that. And if you have to travel or you have to do this at odd times, it can be again difficult. So confirm as best you can and be prepared though in your schedule as you design it for the BIAs. Be prepared to have some open time for people you may need to shift or move around. All right. Now, number 5, provide copies of all the BIA reference materials because again, they're not going to come with it. They're not going to be ready. They're not BIA experts. Make sure you have reference materials ready for them, whether that's electronic or if they're in the room with you. What's the overview of the BIA, financial impact scales, all these things they need in order to complete the BIA effectively and efficiently. Okay, so as we stated earlier, steps in the interview, get that BIA overview completed. Make sure again that you review and confirm all of the department information they provided, and then go through your analysis, which is really critical. Go through again, confirming all of the processes, getting their impacts, determining what computer systems and apps they need, defining their RPOs for their core systems and apps, manual workarounds, dependencies, and vital records. It's a very systematic approach to basically dissecting each process they perform, how important it is, and everything they need in order to perform it. I like it. I think it's critical. And I think all of you over time, by doing this for your company, you become experts in what your company does. You know what departments do, when they do it, when it's important, when it's not, and what they depend on. You become truly a subject matter expert in your company's operations. Here's an example of our specific, and here's how we would do it. So if I'm handling this specific interview, you can do the same approach in an Excel sheet. We start our BIA interviews, as I stated, with the department overview. Who's facilitating? A description of the business unit, hours of operation, number of employees for the entire department. What are some potential changes happening? Going through that process, any reorganizations, any new systems or apps. We just slowly bring them into the BIA process. So we go through each and every one of these questions in the department overview. Typically, this won't take me more than 5 to 7 minutes to go through it and get a quick department overview. Once that's completed, we then move into an overview of each of their processes. In this case, for example, we have a call center. This is a sample call center. As you can see, it's only got 2 processes. Most of them will have more, but in this specific example, so our first process is inbound calls. So we take them through for each of their processes the entire interview. We go first and foremost, we ask them about their process. Inbound calls. Does it have a current RTO? Regulatory, contractual requirements, service level expectations, maximum allowable downtime. Any other comments? Where do this staff for this process has 100? Where do they work? So as you begin to see, we're now going down to the process level. We're now at an overview of the process. We then move from an overview of the individual process to that process. Now let's understand its impacts to the organization. Here's the dollar and non-dollar impact categories. We then ask them, over the RTOs we established, what's the impact over time if I could not perform this process? This data and information here is what gives us the criticality, and it, most importantly, will help, again, all this data here is used to calculate the recovery time objective of this process. So we've gone over the process, an overview. We've identified what the impacts if I couldn't perform it over time. We then begin to ask, what are the dependencies you have? Here's dependencies from a systems perspective. Is it a third-party system, which I mean third-party means it runs outside of the organization. Is it cloud-based? Does somebody else do it for us, etc.? We then ask the reliance on that system, its recovery point objective. Does a workaround exist, or if it is it documented? And then any specialized equipment they need. We make some assumptions. We assume that, again, everybody needs a laptop or a desktop. They need a fax, they need a phone, so we don't list that. Years ago, we used to. And then also from a systems and apps perspective, we make some assumptions. IT always says, here's our standard configuration. Assume we know everybody needs email. We know everybody needs internet. So we don't list a lot of those. We only list those critical core systems they need. Okay. All right. And then lastly, we ask dependencies. And very important here, we just ask what are internal and external dependencies, manual workarounds, and vital records. That completes the interview for a process. We continue till we're all done with each of the processes. In the end, we quickly send them a detailed report, which you would be able to do with your tool, whether it's Excel, etc. What are the results of that interview? We then give them a specific amount of time to review it, which typically is a week. Once they've done that, we say, okay, now the BIA is complete. We validate your processes. Now, in the end, here's what you want to see. Because in the end, you want to give your management, here's an example of a hospital. You want to be able to give them an example as to what are the RTOs across our organization. For example, here's what needs to be recovered in 10 minutes, 4 hours, 24, 72, and greater than that. Here's the departments and the processes across the organization. Basically, this is a playbook on how we need to recover our organizations. Okay. Here's some, I know, Catherine, thank you for sending some questions that have come over. Here's some quick questions. Question number one, you touched on conducting remote interviews in the current environment. Do you have any tips you can offer this? Again, I think when remote interviews require you to be highly precise, you have little room for error because, again, people are already, are remote. They're not one-on-one. So it's really important that you, again, make sure you're ready, your technology's good, get logged on early, and make sure it's up and running properly. Number two, we also, you talked about the number of people in an interview, but who should be in an interview? All right. We always ask department heads, who are the people in your department that understand the department and the processes? The ones that can talk to us about the impacts, the dependencies, etc. I don't need the entire department, but get those that are closest to the departments and the processes. Senior level people, they're going to have a strategic view versus a lower level view. I want people, especially if I'm doing it at the department level, that understand the department and the process that they perform, which should be a limited number of people. Okay, let's see. Where can I find more information about impact categories RTOs? This has been covered now in our part 3, which is available now on our resources page of our website. So very important. You can just go back to that. It's already on our website. You can find information on RTOs and RPOs. Okay, let's see. I think there was a question here. Can you elaborate process versus activity? Oh, yes. So typically what you'll have is, let's say the process is payroll. Well, there's a lot of activities or processing payroll could be the process, right? Under that could be many different activities which make up the payroll process. So you have to be careful that it's not an activity but a process. What is it? What is the core process that I'm performing? And again, a lot of times activities may be under that process, could be process time and data information. Could be add in new employees to be an activity. But in the end, the process is payroll. So make sure you that it's not an activity, that again, you're looking to identify and assess processes. Okay, I think those were all the questions I had. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you everybody for your time. I'd like to thank again all you who attended today. I hope this was helpful. If you have any other questions, please feel free to send them to me. Have a wonderful day, and thank you again for attending the MHA Consulting BIA webinar.